I was able to see the village history book. It was very noticeable to me that dates weren't included in the book until the recording of this date when they first saw a village being bombed. It wasn't their own village. They saw the village across the valley being bombed, and they have a pretty good record of the exact month and year because it happened during their rice harvest festival. The man who explained this history to me, Weepat, said that, that very day, he and his family, he was just a kid at the time, he and his family fled into the forest. And it's noticeable in his account that after that, dates are very common, dates and figures. And you can see this is a real turning point where the village they had been involved in the Indo-Chinese Communist movement since the 1940s, but with the intensification of the war, you can see that they really get involved in the the administrative way of looking at time. So Weepat himself, he was only, I think, 12 years old or something when he was after this bombing incident. He went and lived in the forest with his family, and then he got involved in being a barefoot doctor, a medic, walking around giving vaccinations and free medical care to people in his area in support of the war effort.
Today's guest is Holly Hai, who you just heard in the intro. We'll be talking about the often forgotten socialist country, forgotten in the West that is, of Laos. We'll be learning about Laos, also known as Laos, or officially as the Lao People's Democratic Republic, through Holly's recent and excellently detailed work entitled Projectland, Life in the Lao Socialist Model Village. Holly is an anthropologist who's done fieldwork in Laos for over 2 decades, using ethnographic methods and anthropological analysis to understand the human experience there. She studied at Australian National University and held postdoctoral positions at Yale and Cambridge. She's written, among other topics, about Lao policy, including cultural, poverty, health, and agricultural policies in relation to the lived experience in that country, as well as everyday socialist politics in Laos. This first part of our 2-part discussion will look at the revolutionary origins of Laos. We'll be discussing the pre-revolutionary period, inclusive of both Siamese colonial rule and Laos as part of the French Indochina colony, the successful People's War of 1945 to 1975, including the horrific bombing campaign carried out by the US, which shapes the country to this day. And to add a unique twist to our talk, we'll be learning about the revolution through the lens of the ethnic minority Gantu people, whom Holly spent extensive time with in Laos, whose experiences and culture give a unique perspective of Laos' successful socialist revolution. More info regarding our discussion can be found at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. If you are unable to contribute, no problem. You can help by sharing this with family, friends, and comrades, and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review if you have time. To all those who've already done so, thank you. These podcasts are made to be listened to and shared. I recommend checking out the backlog as well when you have the chance. For this particular episode, I recommend checking out the earlier 2-part discussion on Indigenous peoples of the Soviet Union, featuring Alice and Dennis Bartels. Most importantly, you can help out by engaging in local worker struggles. The opening interlude for this episode is a clip from Noam Chomsky discussing his experience reporting in Laos during the late 1960s and early 1970s.
The U.S. bombing of Laos and intrusions into Laos began in the early 1960s. And by 1968 or 69, they had become extremely intensive. Well, the fact that it had nothing to do with the war in Vietnam. This is often falsified. It was just a massive bombing directed against an utterly defenseless peasant society. The reason was partly that they just had a lot of bombers and nothing to do with it. I happened to be in Laos at a time when it was almost the journalistic hub of the universe. So journalists flew in from all over the place, hotshots from the major networks and so on and so forth. Almost none of them would take the trouble to go 30 kilometers into the countryside and interview the refugees. The journalists were all reporting the official stories about the tanks outside Vientiane. But then when they went back to the hotel bar afterwards, they were all laughing about it. They all knew it was complete fabrication. But it didn't matter, you reported it anyway. I mean, when the West carries out massacres and slaughters, we're not supposed to know about it. Nobody cares. It's not investigated. We don't know. just as we don't know the millions, literally, how many people were killed in the Indochina wars. It's not our business. Of course, there were what they call bombies, little cluster bombs all over the place. Children would pick them up and blow up. A farmer's hoe would hit them, and so on. It's still happening. The U.S. has refused to provide any assistance for removing the probably millions of bombs around. I mean, they carried out huge atrocities, massive atrocities, and the least they can do is clear up the remains. I mean, the cynicism of this it's hard to find words for it.
Welcome, Holly High, to our episode today. It's really great to have you on.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to be here.
The socialist nation of Laos, or Laos, surrounded and landlocked by Myanmar, Thailand, China, and Cambodia, to give our listeners some geographic context, is a country masked in obscurity in the West. So Holly, can you tell us what led you as an Australian ethnographer to study so specifically and uniquely the peoples and nation of Laos?
I was really motivated by a love of anthropology and the idea of spending a long period of time with ordinary people as a way of understanding them. I was really taken by this methodology of understanding others, and I wanted to encounter and experience cultural difference. I wanted to learn another language. I wanted to immerse myself in a really different material and cultural setting. But I was not really, when I started my PhD, I didn't have a clear idea of which country I would specialize in. I was quite open to anywhere in the Australian region, whether it be in Australia itself or the Pacific or Asia. So I really wrote a few different PhD proposals for all of those areas. The one that ended up sounding the most convincing was Laos. And partly that was because at that time in the late 1990s, there was not a lot of existing scholarship on Laos. And I think deep down, I've reflected on this because I get asked this question quite a lot, and for a long time I didn't really have a good answer. But I think it is relevant that my parents were anti-Vietnam War protesters, very involved in the university activism in the 1970s in Australia. Australia was involved in the Vietnam War. And so I wasn't completely ignorant of Laos, as maybe a lot of people are. I had heard a bit about it, and I understood that it was an important country historically for Australia's engagement with the region, but also that it was understudied. So I think that was a big part of my motivation.
That's really interesting because living in Canada, Lao essentially doesn't come up at all in any context. But I guess regionally, Laos does play a role with Australia. Could you kind of explain what that role would look like? Is it economic in terms of trade or history?
Well, I think Australia shares with Canada a generally much smaller understanding of Laos than is perhaps warranted, given the importance of that history and Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and all that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think it's a general underrepresentation of Laos in sort of English-speaking sources. But that said, Australia did receive a significant amount of Lao refugees after 1975. And we have today significant diplomatic relationships between Australia and Laos. Australia maintains an embassy there. We have a significant aid program, and we have a lot of Lao students come over and study in Australia. So there are important links between the two.
Laos does show up in Western media. It seems to be in the context of present efforts to remove unexploded ordnance left behind by the U.S. bombing during the Vietnam War. And even in this context, takes second fiddle to conflicts that took place in Vietnam and in Cambodia, which have captured more Western attention. I learned nothing about Laos in school, and even since I got interested in socialist countries and moved leftward, the only real writing I've seen on it has been from Noam Chomsky, who during the 70s, he actually was on the ground there and did some reporting. Everything else that I could find. So I went on YouTube, I did Google searches, I looked on Amazon, on Netflix, just any kind of major mainstream media outlet to kind of see if I could just learn something in preparation for this. And so on Netflix, when I typed in Laos, I think the first item that came up for me was a movie called They Came for My Father, which is about the Khmer Rouge. That was the only thing even connected to that region that came up, and it's totally disconnected, at least from the history of the country itself. Another thing I did find on YouTube was a literal CIA-produced documentary. I'll link it for our audience for sure, but it's like produced, I believe, in the 60s, and I watched it, and it was very interesting, I'll say that. And so it's because of this media blackout, it's why I find Projectland, your work that we'll be discussing today, such an important and accessible text on the country. So to set the stage for our discussion, Could you explore and explain what came before the long revolutionary period of the middle 20th century that people have some kind of inkling of during the Vietnam War? What were the material conditions of Laos? What was its political economy or the structure of its society? And lastly, how did European colonization shape the region as it shaped so much of the world?
I'll just give people a geographic sense of the place, I guess. Current-day Laos is in the heart of Indochina, and it has the Mekong River flowing down the western side, and to the east there are rugged mountains that form the border with Vietnam. So historically, this was an area settled by people who understood how to grow rice and millet and other grains. Since about 5,000 years ago, they've been cultivating crops there. And so these were sort of small-scale, self-sustaining populations, if you like. I mean, obviously there was trade in the region, but these were people who were living off the land in various ways. So in the river valleys, you had wet rice, irrigated rice, and up in the mountains you had sort of dry gardens, a little bit of rice, millet and other crops like that. And so there was extraordinary ethnic diversity in this area. Buddhism was very widespread in the river valleys, along with wet rice cultivation, and some in the uplands. But in the uplands, you had a great deal of linguistic and cultural diversity, what they call today minorities. The kingdom is often traced back to the 1400s, with an early attempt in the river valleys to establish a sort of united Lao kingdom. This existed for a couple of hundred years, but after that, Siam, what's now Thailand, really increased its power, and these little principalities in what is now Laos were often vassal states of Siam. From about the 1800s onwards, you get this quite intensive exploitation of the area by Siam. So at that time, the Siamese kingdom was more interested in labour power than in land. And so the Lao populations, when they were defeated or ruled by the Siamese, were often forcibly relocated closer to Siam, so onto the western bank of the Mekong River. And so there are a number of uprisings against Siamese rule, and as a result, there were also a lot of reprisals against the Lao population. So this resulted, for instance, in 1828, the current-day capital of Laos, Vientiane, was completely levelled and depopulated by Rama III of Siam. Current-day populations, it's estimated about 5 times as many Lao people live on the west bank of the Mekong, like in current-day Thailand, than they do live on the east of the Mekong River. After this sort of 1828 sacking, the Siamese considered the populations remaining in Laos as slaves. And so there were continual slave raids occurring even in the uplands of Laos that had nothing to do with the uprisings against Siam. And so this was one of the reasons when the French arrived on the scene in about 1880 onwards, they used the existing slavery system as a reason to argue that they should have control over Lao territories. They also pointed to Siamese neglect of these kingdoms and some really arcane legal arguments to argue that some parts of Laos were historically vassals of Vietnam and therefore France should be able to assert control over them. It was quite flimsy reasons. The French were able to establish the Protectorate of Laos in 1893. And so this is the first time you start seeing Laos referred to as a country. Laos, under the French Protectorate, was always sort of second fiddle to Vietnam. France really looked on Vietnam as the economic powerhouse of Indochina, and Laos was, from Vietnam, quite difficult to access. The French were trying to build transport routes using the Mekong River, for instance, but this never worked because the river's just not good for that. And Vietnamese populations were relocated to Laos, and France would have gone on with more resettlements like that. But of course, the Second World War came along, and during that period, the Japanese encouraged a local independence movement in Laos. They helped in 1945 by interring the existing French authorities in the cities. And during this period, Laos declared independence in 1945. Then from 1946, the French wanted to reassert control, and there was quite a lot of violence in this sort of post-war period. And the Lao Itsala, the Lao independence movement, was driven out of government and into hiding. Many of them fled to Bangkok, and over time they split into 3 factions, one of them finding a way to live with the French and assist the French, moving towards sort of independence under the French and another under Prince Suphanavong made an alliance with the Indochinese Communist Party and Ho Chi Minh. And another section were interested in defending Laos as a neutral country. From this sort of post-war period, you start to see more American involvement in the war. Quite a complicated history about why Laos became a war zone during the supposedly Cold War.
So you'd mentioned how when the French came in, they were using a whole bunch of rationales for why they were going to be taking over. What came to mind for me, you'd mentioned that because the Siamese were enslaving the people and the French were like, hey, slavery is bad. So that gives us a moral right, a white man's burden to go in and take over from there. But then from what I understand, the French then would implement similar labor conditions on people, similar to what happened in Africa. When they came in, they specifically, for example, Nigeria, they came out the stated intent to wipe out the slave trade. And then what they instituted when they got there was forced labor, in quotes, that's what they called it. They would also integrate the local forms of slavery into their own economic processes. So that's what it sounds like the French pretty much did. I do know in Vietnam under the French, things like literacy and education were stifled in a way. Literacy rates dropped. Education was only accessible to a very small minority who did the bidding of colonial powers. Was that the case for Laos as well? Was there like an upper class of Laotians who were collaborators with the French, or were they Vietnamese people? What was that structure of that society in terms of collaborators and non-collaborators?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the French Indochina, they made a moral campaign against slavery, but at the same time instituted corvée labour and regressive tax systems, which were a heavy burden on ordinary people. So people were requisitioned to do road building projects, and on the Vietnamese side of the border, there were big plantations where people from the uplands were seized and forced to work on these plantations. So historians have pointed out that the French really undermined their own moral project of setting up the so-called protectorate of Laos, because a lot of people didn't feel particularly well protected under this regime. And at the same time, there was a lot of economic hardship came along with colonialism. So the people that I studied for Projectland lived in the high mountains in between Vietnam and Laos and had historically depended on trade to obtain basic foodstuffs such as salt. And the French imposed a salt blockade on the uplands. And there were other hardships, which I speculate in Projectland was one of the motivating forces behind people in the uplands, surprisingly getting behind the Indochinese Communist Party from the 1940s quite early on. You know, it wasn't for sure that these people were going to join this international movement because they had resisted previous attempts to colonize them. So earlier ethnographers described these upland villages as fortresses, typically in a round, this is the ethnic Gantu people, typically in a round formation with sharpened stakes and, you know, wooden poles around the village so that if necessary, they could close themselves off. Other ethnographers have speculated that this was because of the slaving that was going on at the time. So these people lived in rugged, inaccessible mountaintops, which were not particularly good for agriculture, but it did give them an edge in trade between Laos on the one side and Vietnam on the other. That's sort of how they were surviving, and they didn't necessarily need to join the Indochinese Communist Party, but it's interesting that they did.
Sounds like they had an anti-colonial history that they could draw on, whether it was the Siamese or the French. One thing that you said that struck me was that the Japanese encouraged local resistance and supported an independence movement. I'm just trying to figure that out in my head, because the Japanese, of course, were the so-called Axis powers during World War II. France at the time was under
Vichy France,
German control. Yeah, Vichy France. And so I assume Vietnam and Laos were, could you explain that?
Yeah, I know. It's super confusing time. I hope that somebody will look into it. But what I've read is that the Japanese predicted that the Vichy France was going to fall and de Gaulle was going to lead Free France back into Laos. For some reason, which I think is probably quite amazing and deeply admirable, they decided that the best thing to do would be to free Laos rather than to have it under French control. I really hope that a historian goes into that and explains it and unpacks it. But it was a very confusing year. It was all at the sort of 1945 when there was a lot of tumult going on.
Yeah, no, that it's totally fair. World War II, learning about it beyond kind of like the summaries or the way different countries presented, particularly the UK or the US, it is very complex conflict. I've heard that like at one point there was a contingent of people in India who were supporting the Nazis as well. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of these very unexpected alliances and even feuds during the war itself. I mean, the Soviet Union and the United States and the UK were all allies, which in itself is incredibly strange. So hopefully someone does look into that and gets more information. Was there anything else you want to say in regards to this pre-revolutionary period?
So I guess the only other thing I would say is that there were a lot of uprisings against various attempts to control these regions, but a lot of these were spiritually motivated. And so there were sort of millennial cults and Buddhist-inspired, holy men uprisings and charismatic figures in the uplands who were sort of resisting French colonialism. Because these were based on sort of individual charismatic figures, they often weren't sustainable. But there's a long history of resistance in the area.
Out of these complex and dire circumstances that you've just explained underneath the Siamese and the French, that there emerges a viable revolutionary alternative to colonial rule, which crystallized around the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, also known as the Lao Independence Movement or the Laos People Party, which emerged as a revolutionary communist movement in the 1940s and 1950s after the war, similar to what occurred in Vietnam. Can you give us insight into this decades-long struggle for power? What did it entail? Who were the supporters of the revolution and who were its enemies?
The Lao call it the 30-year struggle. They count it from 1945 with that Declaration of Independence up to 1975 with the Declaration of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. So it was as I said, the Lao independence government that was announced in 1945 was quickly forced into hiding and split into three factions, one of them aligning itself with the Vietnamese and the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, another aligning itself with the returning French, and a third hoping for Lao neutrality in the middle of all of this. The ones that aligned themselves with the French established what's called the Royal Lao Government, the RLG, and they had their forces concentrated in the Mekong River Valley, where all of the major cities are. So Vientiane, Luang Prabang, Pak Se. And these were sort of the cities. They were concentrations of ethnic Lao people and Buddhism. And then the people who became the Lao People's Revolutionary Army, they had a lot of support from Vietnam. That was their number one ally. And they were concentrated in sort of the remote mountainous regions, first in the north, in Pong Saly and Vieng Sai sort of area. And eventually, as the 1940s went on, they established bases down where I work in Sekong and Atapu and that sort of area. They were concentrated in the mountainous east. The war sort of played out between communist forces concentrated in the uplands and these Royal Lao government-controlled cities. Because of the alliance with Vietnam, Lao territories were used to ferry supplies from North Vietnam down to the south to support the North Vietnamese Army's war effort there in the south. And so that's what they call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that's one reason why Laos got drawn into, I guess, global geopolitics, because America decided that they would try to stop this supply route by bombing the roads, and proved a really ineffective strategy because you can't really stop people from carrying stuff around simply by dropping bombs. But they did try, and Laos is now the most heavily bombed country per capita in the world. I think you mentioned in your opening comments that this is maybe something that if people know anything about Laos, it's about this unexploded ordnance, which is a very real problem for the country. The other area that was really intensively bombed is the area to the south of the Plain of Jars. So this was an area that was very disputed in the war as the People's Revolutionary Army was sort of pushing down from the north and from the east, and the Royal Lao government was trying to defend this plains area. These bombing campaigns were sort of very intense certain periods of the war, but altogether it probably went for, say, over 15 years. So in this period, there were lots of refugees, lots of displaced people. And unfortunately, people's means of subsistence was often what was attacked during the bombing of Laos, because they were trying to stop, in the south with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they're trying to stop people carrying stuff. And so even nature itself became an enemy. They sprayed defoliants and used napalm to burn the forests because they thought that people were carrying supplies under cover of trees. So trees became an enemy. And if they couldn't find any targets to bomb, there are records that people's buffalo were used as targets. People have told me stories that if they kept a pig, for instance, they'd have to be very careful to see if the evidence of the pig being alive, like making a muddy patch, would be visible from the sky, because even a muddy patch like that would become a target in the bombing. It was an extremely disruptive and debilitating time for Laos.
To your point of it being the most heavily bombed country in history, and I believe it's per capita, 260 million bombs were dropped. And I believe roughly 30% of those have not yet exploded, which means that still to this day, people are not only being maimed and injured by these ordinances that do end up exploding when people find them or touch them or dig them up. People are still dying from them as well. These are technically still war casualties, unfortunately, from that period. This history of bombing, what it, like the way I conceive of it at least, is that it's during World War II, of course, the US bombed Japan. They used the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also there's an even more intense firebombing campaign which preceded that. A lot of it was not questioned morally. It was deemed necessary to do, and it was supported or presented on that basis. Then after the war, the US would also carry out an even more intense bombing campaign on North Korea during the Korean War, where they totally destroyed the country. I believe it's something like 90% of the cities were just totally destroyed. About 20% of the North Korean population died during that period. So in my mind, I see this intense bombing campaign that the US conducted in Laos and in Vietnam as being just a kind of continuation of that total war, total destruction policy, not really caring about what the human cost is.
In the Lao government publications describing this area, they often use the phrase burn clear, kill clear, destroy clear. They call it the 3 clears. They say this was the strategy of the Royal Lao government and their American supporters, was just to completely sort of wipe out. It's hard to translate this word clear. It means like basically to wipe out so that there's absolutely nothing there. And in response, the Lao People's Revolutionary Army, their counter strategy was everything for the front, everything for the war. So it was a period where people were asked to, everyday people were asked to contribute whatever they could, depending, men and women, old people, young people, everybody could contribute to this resistance, to this attempt to really destroy a whole part of the country.
It's incredibly interesting how the bombings themselves, they had the unexpected or unintended effect of strengthening a lot of these resistance movements, whether it's in North Korea or in Vietnam and Laos. There's a story, incredibly depressing, of this woman that you mentioned, you talked about in Projectland, how prior to these bombings, when a woman was pregnant and about to give birth, she'd have a community, she'd have support people there, of course, to help her deliver the baby. But because of the intense bombing, people couldn't come out to see each other or to, congregate because they might be seen from above. And so I just thought that was heartbreaking. Luckily, it sounds like, at least for that pregnancy, the child survived, but I'm sure in many other cases, that's not what occurred.
That's in the Ho Chi Minh Trail area. People couldn't do anything that would give a sense of the area being inhabited. So they scattered into the forest. They didn't live in their villages. They had to be very careful about how they cultivated food. People would wear leaves on their backs as they moved around and live in tiny groups. So this particular woman, I asked her why people say ethnic minorities give birth in the forest alone. It's a bit of a cliche that people in Vientiane say about ethnic minority people. And so she was quite elderly and had a lot of children. So I said to her, is it true that in the past ethnic Gantu women gave birth in the forest alone? And she gave me these stories which made it clear that giving birth in the forest alone was one of the hardships she lived through during the war because of the conditions of the bombing.
The Kantu people, which you cover in Projectland, the way they tell their history doesn't start with the bombing, but it seems to be that is like a defining maybe watershed point in their community narrative of their own history.
That's right. I was able to see the village history book, and it was very noticeable to me that dates weren't included in the book until the recording of this date when they first saw a village being bombed. It wasn't their own village. They saw the village across the valley being bombed, and they have a pretty good record of the exact month and year because it happened during their rice harvest festival. The man who explained this history to me, Weepat, said that, that very day, he and his family, he was just a kid at the time, he and his family fled into the forest. And it's noticeable in his account that after that, dates are very common in the dates and figures. And you can see this is a real turning point where the village gets... They had been involved in the Indo-Chinese communist movement since the 1940s, but with the intensification of the war, you can see that they really get involved in the sort of the administrative sort of way of looking at time. And so Weepat himself, he was only, I think, 12 years old or something when he was after this bombing incident. He went and lived in the forest with his family, and then he got involved in being a barefoot doctor, a medic, walking around giving vaccinations and free medical care to people in his area in support of the war effort.
I'll link to this on the website. There's a video that Mother Jones produced. It's a publication in the US, which is like a time-lapse video of where the bombs hit in Laos. So each dot as time passes through demonstrates this. It's incredibly chilling, but it does demonstrate how devastating bombing would have had on people, on their livelihood, their lives, the land itself in which they live off of. It's totally, of course, shaped the way the country is today. So given all this, given our discussion about the bombing, I'm just trying to imagine who supported the Royal Lao government and for like what reasons, right? Given the atrocity that was occurring with the US bombing, or what were their motivations?
This is a good question. I haven't thought much about the psychology of what was going on there, but obviously in a very broad brushstrokes perspective, what was going on was the so-called Cold War. Honik Kwon, an anthropologist, has recently described it as a global civil war. Civil wars tend to be messy. They tend to involve people who know one another and have long histories with each other, and they tend to play out very differently in different areas. And so I think I agree with him that we can productively think of the Cold War better as a global civil war. And it just so happens that in Laos, this war was played out in an extremely violent way, with countries that were very far away from Laos suddenly deciding it was very important that they sort of invest like millions and millions of dollars in trying to sway the outcome of this war. So a lot of people, for instance, pronounce Laos Laos. Have you heard that pronunciation, Laos? So an interesting tidbit of history is that President Kennedy was going on TV to address the American people to explain why they should be getting involved in this war in this country that people had literally never heard of. His famous line was something like, Laos is far away, but it's crucial for us to get involved. I can't remember exactly what his words were, but he was going to deliver this and he was like, I can't say Laos because people are just going to think that's some kind of insect that lives in your hair. So he decided to change it to Laos to try to get American people more interested in this war, which literally had nothing to do with them. But yeah, I think that's just the nature of the global civil war that was the Cold War.
That framing of the Cold War as a civil war, it's the first time I've heard that, but I think that's such an excellent frame to look at it from. Other kind of framings I've heard is that it was a class war, essentially, in the sense that the capitalist class, those who were in industry, those who were just in positions of power in general across the world, did not want that power balance to shift in the way that communist socialists wanted to push the world. And so I guess from that context, then the US is bombing Laos in order to stop the burgeoning left-wing socialist communist movement there, but also at that time throughout that part of Asia. So, of course, there was Vietnam, which had revolutionary ambitions. China, of course, at this point had already been socialist or became socialist in 1950. So I guess soon before that, Indonesia had, I believe, the biggest communist party in the world at that time, which is hard to believe now, given the ruling ideology of the country itself today. But a very brutal repression was carried out in Asia during this time. And I feel like it gets glossed over or not really demonstrated in any way. If you watch any kind of like movie on Vietnam, it focuses on the American soldiers themselves and how horrific it was for them. But in that region, even as the Vietnam War itself, millions of people died or were killed or died as a result of the war conditions. Vincent Bevins has a book called The Jakarta Method, in which he explains how the Indonesian government essentially started a genocide, I guess, against communists in the country, killing at least 1 million people. But the way it gets presented is that communists and socialists are the rulers or the ones who want a murderous regime to be in charge, while millions of people are actually being slaughtered by the US and their allies. So I'm just like so stuck on that as why would people support them?
Yeah, I was speaking to a Lao historian as she was going through the archives, looking at that moment where the Royal Lao government leader, like the Prime Minister, was informed about America's bombing of his own country. And he was like, he didn't protest. He didn't say, this is disgusting, I cannot abide by this happening in my own country. There was a kind of passiveness. Yeah, so she described how incredibly angry she felt reading these archives, such immense suffering for such, it's very difficult for us today to understand why on earth this political struggle about the way, basically the way society is either, I don't think neoliberalism, liberalism and socialism are so radically different. I think they're more thought of as, in a sort of kinship. They have a lot of kinship with each other. These are modernizing approaches. These are about improving people's lives. What they differ on is the importance of equality and the importance of a communal way of looking at things as opposed to individual. But these are not like completely different worldviews. They have quite a lot in common. It's very hard looking back to get into the shoes or the psychology of why people would have thought it was worth killing millions of people and devastating the environment so profoundly. It's just, it's very, I don't know that there's much point trying to make sense of it or understand it. What do you think?
Well, I do see your point about how these different political economic systems, they all exist because of one another, as in neoliberalism comes from liberalism and socialism, I guess, is a response to liberalism in the classical sense. So yeah, I do see that. And I guess the way I will think about it, or to make sense of it all, is this perspective of the class war, of corporations, big business really wanting to maintain power. It seems so nefarious. I don't know. It's hard to think about for sure.
But what we can do is study particular people's narratives of this time. I think because I'm an anthropologist, of course I'm going to say this. I think going with a particular case study and going deep into a small group of people's particular experiences, I think is the way to go to build up a picture of this general situation. So I do think that in Ban Gandon, people were passionate about joining the revolution. It's hard to tell, of course, speaking to people in the current day about their memories. But, they're not saying that it was easy or that they didn't give anything up, in this. As I said, socialism, just like the alternative, was a pathway of tremendous sacrifice for these people. They talk often about how much they gave up in terms of their traditional way of life. And also, obviously, gave up a lot during the military struggle. A lot of people died. A lot of families were separated. There was a lot of suffering for the cause. But I think overall, they are very proud of what they did during the revolution. I guess what I tried to talk about in Projectland was that even though Laos, a lot of people would dismiss it and say, well, it's not really a socialist state because they don't have, say, free healthcare or any of these other basic things that you would love to see in a socialist state. I would qualify that by saying they do have some free healthcare. Anyway, rather than getting into all of these sort of debates about how the economy's run, as an anthropologist, I was really looking at how socialism operates on a cultural level. So I looked at political culture, where I felt that socialist ideas and values still carried a lot of weight in how people conducted themselves politically, and also the politics of culture, like the definition itself of what is culture and what are we doing when we talk about ethnic minorities and how they can engage with a modern state. What is the culture slot for these people? And I guess in the back of my mind, I was comparing this to what I know about how Indigenous people in Australia, how they're treated under a liberal state. And I thought the contrasts and parallels were really interesting and helped with Laos. And it helped me understand the importance of sort of socialist traditions of thought in contemporary Laos.
Projectland explores your on-the-ground ethnographic research, as what you've just explained, the things that you focus on. Particularly, it looks at what the Laotian government or what the Lao government calls a socialist model village.
The Lao government calls it a model village. I called it a socialist model village.
Okay. So the name of the town is New Gandon, which is inhabited by the ethnic minority Gantu people. I'd like to discuss the history and experience of this community. So reading your book, what kept coming to my mind, as you've already mentioned, is in the 20th century how socialist nations approached ethnic minorities and individual nations within their own field of power. In writings of Lenin, of Stalin, of other socialist figures of that period, they call this the nationalities question. It's so intriguing because their policies and their view of how to address these issues ran totally counter to what was often experienced by minorities in capitalist countries, such as in Canada, where I come from, which is a settler colonial country, much like Australia. I'm not sure if you've had the chance, but there was an episode where I did speak with two ethnographers, Alice and Dennis Bartels. These in the 80s, they were back and forth between Russia studying the indigenous peoples there. That's what came to mind as I was reading your book. I was making the connections between those two. So could you explain the history and the experience of the Gantu people in Ugandan?
Yes, I did have a chance to listen to the Bartels podcast, and yeah, I'm like you. I'm amazed at the parallels with Laos. How to sum up the history of the Gantu people? Well, I've mentioned that they had this role in the 30-year struggle. So another ethnographer a French ethnographer, Yves Goudinot, has suggested that this particular village, Ban Gandon, was the centre of the revolution in the south. And so people in there recounting their memories of the struggle period said that there were Vietnamese bases on Gandon territory, important political leaders like the man who went on to become the provincial chief of Saigon after the liberation, who was a Vietnamese. He was sent by Ho Chi Minh as a young Vietnamese youth to go and radicalize the uplands of Laos. And he ended up in Gandon territories, and he was the head of a base there. And after the revolution, he became the first provincial governor of Saigon. So he, for instance, was living for a time on Gandon territory. So they were very involved in the 30-year struggle. But then after 1975, they were relieved that the bombing campaign was finished, and the Lao government was like, okay, now it's time to come out of the forest, reconsolidate your old villages, which they did, and then they encouraged them to consolidate again into one single village. My main person who sort of took me in this village and told me the most about history was a man called Weepat, who was the village chief when I lived there and still is today. So he told me that he was a young man back in 1975, and he was sort of waiting for all of these improvements. His whole life he'd been involved in this struggle and had given up so much for it. And now it seemed to him that the older people in the village were happy just to sit around and, live as they had before the war and try and reclaim some semblance of life before the war. But Weepat wasn't interested in that. He wanted all of the things he'd heard about. He was sick of carrying people on his shoulders to medical care, which was like a 3-day hike through the mountains, carrying sick people. He was a father by then, and he'd already lost a couple of children to illness. He said that when he was a kid and he said to his dad he wanted to learn to read, his father beat him up, and he only learned to read because of joining the socialist movement. And he wanted his own kids to have a chance to have better education than he'd had. With all of this playing on his mind, he wrote a secret letter to the district governor saying that he was interested in being resettled out of this very remote, inaccessible area into an area where he and his family and co-villagers could access more of these sort of promises that he felt they'd been made during the struggle. It took some time, but in 1996, he led the entire population of Old Gandon out of the mountains into a plains area just off the edge of the Bolivan Plateau, which is not, it's about half an hour away from the Saigon provincial capital these days, where there's a hospital. And so the new site has facilities such as a primary school and a high school. There's about 1,000 people living there now. This was not at all easy. I hope that we've emphasised enough that Laos was and remains a low resource setting, and partly because of the devastation left by the war, economic sanctions that were imposed after 1975, natural disasters such as floods and rain, droughts and this sort of thing. For all these reasons, the resettlement took place in, a very basic style, and people described to me incredible hardships on resettling. Some people say during that time we only ate unripe bananas because the village next door to them was involved in a project of banana plantation, and so they amazingly when these new settlers came out of the mountains, they let them eat as many bananas as they wanted. But of course, that wasn't adequate nutrition for these people. So it was incredibly difficult. They had a cholera outbreak when they first arrived, other things like this. So in 2001, 87 people left and they went back to the traditional territories, to Old Gandon up high in the mountains, and started the old village there again. So now today you have Old Gandon and New Gandon, and they're about 2 or 3 days walk away.
So I just want to clarify, Gandon was one of these, like the original village Gandon was one of these upland remote areas, kind of like you talked about earlier?
That's right. So Yves Goodenough has described these as fortresses and also as upland cities. He thought that the populations of these upland Gantu villages was probably quite large, and that they were sort of fortresses. They were deliberately in inaccessible places to avoid the slave trade and to be easily defendable, and also to exploit possibilities of trade between Laos and Vietnam.
Similar to what had happened in the Soviet Union with indigenous peoples, from what I understand, the Communist Party would have sent out essentially emissaries to these communities to establish a connection with them. And then, and could you clarify, so it's like in order for them to either receive support from the Communist Party, was that they had to change some of their social practices? And I guess through that economic practices as well? Was that the case?
Absolutely. Weepat describes a scene when he was a little child. So he says that the village, historically, Old Gandon, like up in the mountains, it was in a circular formation with the sharpened stakes around the outside. And inside, there was a circle of houses, each facing towards the middle. Right in the centre was a community hall, sort of where important ritual events would take place. So that's all still the way an upland Gantu village is today. Outside the community hall was a stake for where buffaloes were tied when they were sacrificed. And then he said on the other side of that was something called the Jinai, which I've never seen. But he said it was a sacred grove where plants grew, surrounded by stones. And each time they had a village festival, they would plant a stone in that boundary that was around the sacred grove. And then they would plant a special plant in there as well. And these plants were not to be touched, not to be used for food or anything. And like it was especially bad news, say if the buffalo tied up at the buffalo stake went to eat any of the fruit or plants that were growing in that sacred grove, that was very bad. So there was sort of this protected piece of forest within the bounded area of the village. And this was bound up with all kinds of rituals about the village as a enclosed space and a community. Historically, people from outside the village, like people who were not members of the village, were not allowed to sleep in the village. So there was a place outside that was like a little basic shelter where if there was a guest for whatever reason who wasn't a member of the village, they could stay in this little shelter and people would bring them food to eat there. And there was a big prohibition on people, outsiders, cooking, for instance, in the village. One exception would be during the annual village festival. They had a festival, they would invite one particular other village to be their guests, and they would really invite them in. That's when they'd plant the new stone and the new plant, and they'd have like a mock battle on arrival, and then they'd host them and feed them and let them sleep in the communal hall in the centre. But that was a big deal, and most of the time guests were not allowed inside the village space at all. So obviously this was a big problem for the socialist movement, who were really relying on the hospitality of uplanders to spread this movement. In the book, I detail what we sort of now understand to be some of the strategies the revolutionaries were using to try and incorporate uplanders. So I already mentioned Born Yuan, who ended up being the provincial governor of Sekong province after the war. So he gave a few oral history accounts and also a written history account before he passed away. And from that, we can gather that they took a really softly approach. So sort of stay outside the village and gain a little bit of trust, but eventually, learn the local language. Born Yuan even married a local woman, share the work of local people, and try to sort of, I say it's very similar to the ethnographic method, like actually spending a long period living with these people before you try to affect any change. So there's this long period, but ultimately the goal was to change these people. And so Weepat's story, his recollection from when he was a child, was a revolutionary cadre. He didn't tell me his name. I don't know if it was Born Yuan or someone else, standing on the deck of the community hall and aiming his gun at the sacred grove. and saying, this is a gun, and if your spirit is powerful, then I won't be able to shoot your sacred grove. But if I can hit one of the stones in the sacred grove, then you know that my gun is more powerful than the spirit. And so he fired, and the first bullet was a dud, and everyone's like, the spirit wins. And then he fired again, and it exploded, something in the sacred grove. And Weepat says on that day, people dug up the stones and threw them outside the village and dug up the sacred grove. And from that day on, outsiders were allowed to sleep in the village, and even outsiders could marry local women, and all of these things that had not been previously made the village a really self-enclosed, independent community started to be eroded, and it became part of this much more integrated region-wide movement.
Stay tuned for part 2 of the discussion with Holly, where we'll be discussing socialist culture and democracy in Laos. Until next time.